running my time? No. Okay, so the Outer Space Treaty was a multilateral treaty that forms the basis of international space law. It was created in 1967 out of fear of the Cold War and of a nuclear war between Russia and America. Its original intentions were to increase space innovation. However, it's really failed to do that, and I'm going to get into that more later. Because the main thing that this treaty does is it makes it impossible to claim any territory in space. So that means anywhere in space, you cannot claim any asteroid, any celestial body, any star, any moon, anything at all, because it's all supposed to be, up for it. It's everybody's responsibility or something. So 110 countries have signed the treaty, but only actually 11 countries in the entire world have launched satellites into space, and only 3 have sent humans to space. So a lot of countries are in this treaty. However, most of them have not actually gone to space or have any sort of business in space currently. So what we can see, so our plan is to withdraw by 2025 and immediately make our intentions known and kind of present an argument to the world about why we're leaving, so that we might see other countries following us and also leaving the treaty, as the United States is a global superpower and other countries could follow suit. So that would mean that a new treaty could possibly be drafted that maybe doesn't include this thing where nobody can, where it's impossible to claim anything in space. And it might also be more representative if a new treaty is drafted where the United States is leading that front, instead of this treaty being drafted in 1967 out of fear of the Cold War. So our weighing mechanism should be global net benefits, so that includes the environment here on Earth, humans on Earth, extraterrestrial beings, planets, everything. Because we're talking about space, and that is more than just our planet. So our first advantage is that leaving the treaty is going to increase space exploration and innovation. So in this status quo, as I've talked about, it's impossible to claim any territory in space. And what this means is that our subpoint A is that poor and spaceless countries have less of a reason to innovate or explore space. So because currently they feel like they're too far behind in technology compared to major countries that are already in space, because sending a satellite, sending a person to space requires an enormous amount of research and technology development. So, and right now countries know that even if they began development on sending people to space or increasing their presence in space, they wouldn't even be able to claim anything in space as theirs. All they would be able to do is maybe send an unmanned mission somewhere, but that's already happened. Large countries are already exploring space, and by the time smaller countries or poor countries get to space, a lot of things will already be explored, and you're going to want to claim an asteroid, maybe for the minerals that we might need on Earth, because we're running out of finite resources. Right? So smaller countries have less innovation to research and develop and go to space, because by the time they get there, a lot of space is going to be explored, and they're going to want to claim territory. Also, space is huge. So, I mean, it's unimaginably large. It's not like we're going to fight about territory in space, because you can always go a little further, and it's essentially infinite compared to the scale that we are used to here on Earth. So, however, in the plan with the United States leaving and possibly other countries following suit, countries would be able to go to space and claim territory, which would actually give them an incentive to go there. So next I'm going to be talking about space leaders. So this is my subpoint B. So the current leaders in space exploration and innovation are the United States, Russia, and China. These are the 3 countries that have sent a person to space. So this is a quote from a prominent space magazine called the Space Review. Quote, "Today human activity in space is confined to low Earth orbit, and unmanned space exploration of the solar system proceeds at a leisurely pace. The space age has sputtered to a crawl, and the 1967 Outer Space Treaty deserves a large measure of the blame." So what happened is, when the Space Treaty was born, energy and excitement for space was very high. However, since this treaty was formed, we've seen a significant decrease in this, because this space treaty makes it impossible for any territory in space to be claimed, and also imposes sort of these gridlock policies on space, which I'm going to get into more. So large countries have less of a reason to go to space, because exploration ultimately is not going to get us very far. And let's say they build on a planet, but they can't actually claim it. That means, let's say the United States wants to extract the minerals and resources on an asteroid. Russia could just come in and set up their own like space factory or whatever there to extract the exact same minerals. And this could lead to conflict, which is actually my second contention, that leaving this space treaty reduces the chances of conflict. So subpoint A is that conflict over territory. So from the same space magazine, quote, competition for the best real estate on celestial bodies itself results in war between the superpowers. So let's look at what this means. Let's say the United States, again, goes to this asteroid full of minerals. But Russia and China want the same asteroid. Because we aren't able to claim anything in space, they can just land there and extract the exact same materials. This is definitely going to lead to increased conflict, as countries are now fighting over materials or places in space that they think are the most valuable. Because you aren't actually able to claim anything, that means it's free, it's up for grabs for anybody. So we can see that these conflicts are quickly going to escalate because space has such enormous opportunity with the resources it provides for us. So this could quickly escalate to a war in space, which is the whole thing that the treaty was trying to prevent. But because of these oral policies, this actually has a higher chance of happening. And by leaving the plan, we are going to be able to claim territory in space. Other countries are going to want to claim territory in space too, so they're going to leave the plan, and then we have fix this issue. So moving on to my third contention is that it makes space fairly representative if we leave this treaty. So currently, as I talked about, there are 110 countries who are in this treaty. However, only 11 have actually sent satellites to space. So subpoint A is that the treaty is currently too representative, because very few of the countries involved in the treaty can actually do anything in space. They have no influence in space whatsoever. So what we see them do is these small, poor countries create gridlock policies so that richer countries are not able to expand and innovate in space as easily because they want a chance to be able to catch up. So my partner is going to get into this contention more, and my time is up. Thank you very much.
I oppose the resolution that the United States federal government should withdraw from the Outer Space Treaty. So our opponents illustrated some of what the treaty includes. However, I would like to add a few things. The first is that the moon and other celestial bodies, or anything in space, basically should be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. No weapons by mass destruction should be used in space. This is a key part of the treaty. And the second thing that I would like to add is that states are liable for the damages caused in space for things done by government actors or non-government actors. So if SpaceX damages something in space, the United States is liable. If NASA does it, they are equally as liable. Okay, so let's just get into our first disadvantage. Our first disadvantage is that by leaving the treaty, this will increase militarism with the United States and China. There's a few things that we should see in the status quo. The first thing is that there are no weapons of mass destruction in space due to the Outer Space Treaty. And secondly, we can see that the presence of this treaty over time has prevented outer space-based military conflict pretty effectively because people are really following this treaty. The third thing we can see right now is that outer space military conflict is very dangerous. This is because it's harder to detect, it's less known, and new technology in space, it's harder to predict what other people are doing because of how unknown the territory is. And the fourth thing we can see in the status quo is that there are growing tensions between the United States and China. We are in a trade war, we are competing to be the global superpower, and we see that basically any territory that isn't actually in the US or China, there's increased militarization and increased conflict. We see this in the South China Sea, we see this in Taiwan, we see this with the United States pairing with Australia to give them nuclear submarines. everywhere that we can militarize against China that isn't on mainland US, we're doing so. Fifthly, we can see that China has recently tested militarizing space with a hypersonic missile. They launched a missile in space, and this was a few weeks ago. They said it was a ship, but most people in the international community know that it was a missile. So what happens when we pull out of the treaty? The first thing is that the US pulls out of the treaty. The second thing that happens is that this signals to China that we want to put weapons of mass destruction in space. This is because they just launched a missile. They're expecting retaliation from the United States and from the international community. And they know that there is escalating conflict between the United States and them, and that the United States is pretty quick to militarize in zones where they see China a threat, like with Australia. The third thing that will happen is that this will simply increase United States and China tensions. Even if, militarization isn't actually happening, but it's expected, diplomatic relations and arguing for increasing human rights in China, on like the United States doing that, it will be harder because the Chinese government will be anticipating, the United States is going to do something against them. They're not as willing to work with the United States because of this increased conflict or tension. And the second thing that could happen because of these increased tensions is that it could actually lead to increased military conflict in space or elsewhere. The fourth thing that will happen is that this likely conflict that would happen in space, this would be probably predominantly affecting territories not in China or the US. It would be like taking place in other places that we're trying to get territory in, like in the South China Sea or in Taiwan, areas that are generally poorer than the US and China. So the impacts of this. The first is we see increased human rights abuses because the United States is less effectively able to negotiate against like the genocide of the Uyghur Muslims. The second thing, we see an increase in debt due to the increase in human rights abuses, but also due to the probability of conflict. And the third is we see a decrease in quality of life because territories or other like areas will be destroyed if we do escalate to conflict in space. Okay, so our second disadvantage is that of sustainability. In the status quo right now, the first thing we can see is that the space treaty says that states are liable for damage caused by countries or non-government organizations. So if Tesla causes environmental damage in space, the United States basically has to pay for it on the international scale. The second thing is that the United States and others are incentivized to keep any like non-government organizations in space non-sustainable, or else we'll lose money. Like sanctions will be placed on us, we'll face some type of repercussions. The third thing we can see in the status quo is that companies have an incentive to abuse the resources in space and on the moon. Like if they can get money from extracting and abusing resources on asteroids or on the moon or something like that, they will do it because it's profitable for them. And the fourth thing that we can see in the status quo is that environmental damage in space could have a serious effect on Earth. If there's like any erosion from the moon, that could really damage, our ecosystem, our air. Like it could be really, really, really bad. So what happens? The United States pulls out of the treaty. The treaty will, basically fall apart. We won't be liable for damage caused by a non-governmental organization. There'll be no incentive for us to regulate like SpaceX or anything like that when they're trying to extract resources on the moon and stuff like this. So that means that basically in space, resources are more likely to be damaged, erosion is more likely to happen, and this is a bad thing. So the impacts of this, damage to like potential ecosystems on the moon, and a risk to human welfare if something were to like happen and there was like debris or fallout from the moon from this like crazy extraction. Okay, now let's go into the government's case. So the first thing they say is like a new treaty could be drafted. For one, I just want to point out they're not arguing for the demise of the treaty. They haven't really said why everybody else would pull out of the treaty. They just said the US should. And right now the United States is less powerful in their like international influence. So in negotiating a new treaty, it actually would probably not really work in our favor. So just wanted to say that. Okay, first, they talk about developing countries in space, and I have a few responses. My first is that developing countries don't need to explore space. They don't really have the resources anyway. They're extremely far away from doing this. And when you're trying to like do anti-corruption, when you're trying to cut the poverty rate in half and decrease unemployment from like 40%, space is pretty much the last thing you're worried about. The second response I have here is that the treaty actually helps smaller countries develop because China and the United States won't have bought up basically all of the territory that could be explored. And by the time these countries could even get there, you know, China and the US could have bought up all the territory and these countries can't even explore. So you can turn this point and make it's easier for developing countries. So third is that they haven't even illustrated why space exploration is good for these countries. It's really only for our intellectual, like, ooh, that's cool. But for a developing country, does it really matter? They haven't really told you why. Okay. The next thing they make is that large countries aren't going to space and like innovation is bad. My response is just that like SpaceX and like Elon Musk versus Jeff Bezos trying to explore space, that's happening right now. NASA's, you know, developing just as they were. I don't really see why this is a problem. They haven't provided any like reasoning for why this is an issue or how it's happening. Their last point is about reducing conflict. I have a few responses. The first is that people aren't extracting and like abusing resources on the moon because of the treaty, and this is a good thing. The second response is that it is better for this stuff not to be owned, so it's not exploited by a country. Like, let's say China does buy up an asteroid or something. They could easily exploit that resource, and we don't want them to be able to do this. This treaty is deterring them from doing that. And with that, I strongly urge a opposition ballot. Thank you.
Everyone is ready, judges and opponents. I can begin. Okay, so my name is Reese Roberts. I will be the second speaker on the affirmation, which is affirming the resolution we've already stated. And just quickly, I'm going to be going over my opponents' responses to our contention and then going into our responses to theirs. Okay, so my time starts. So my time starts now. Going into some of the things that they state at their top of the case, they talk about how states are, a large thing they talk about at the beginning of their case and throughout their case is liability in space and how states should be liable for the damages that are caused. So we'd like to point out that in the status quo this is not happening because there's no enforcement by the space treaty. An example of this is a SpaceX satellite blowing up recently, and there was no accountability taken, no one was really held liable, yet this was a space destruction that falls under the regulations of the treaty. Yet we saw, I'll take it at the end of my contention every time, we saw no liability, we saw no one held accountable, which shows that in the status quo, in this treaty, there is no enforcement. So we can see that there will be there will not be a high likelihood of enforcement throughout the status quo, and in fact, a more likelihood in our world. So just moving on to their responses to, or our responses to their plan. So their first contention is that it increases militarization between the USA and China. They talk about how there are growing tensions between the USA and China. So this is exactly why remaining in the treaty would increase the tensions between the US and China even more. Because essentially, their whole point here is that China and the US are going to be claiming all these things and have all this fighting over the treaty. However, it's much more likely that we see fighting now because, as my partner stated, if the USA goes onto a planet and decides to start using it for minerals or whatever we're mining it for, and China goes on the same planet and starts doing the same thing, that's going to increase tensions much more than if one actually has a strong claim on it and the other country knows and is well aware. Then there would be more likely to go to another planet because outer space is such a large mass that they can find other planets to go to. Then if the USA and China maybe go behind each other's backs, or Russia comes involved, and many global superpowers are essentially working on the same planet and taking it for resources. So therefore, it's largely possible that we're going to see much more conflict between the US and China and these global superpowers in their world if we stay in this treaty. So they talked about how China has recently tested militarization in space. We'd like to affirm this to our point. So essentially, China has been testing these nuclear missiles in space for a while now, under the treaty. So the treaty has been going on currently, and China has been sending these nuclear weapons and these missiles in space, and the US has too, and North Korea has too, and many other countries have been doing this during the treaty. So this shows just the lack of enforcement that this treaty has on all these global superpowers, and why it is extremely unlikely that they would stop doing this, whereas it is highly likely that they would not do this so much and so often in our world, because we would see that they could actually have some sort of claim on a planet and therefore not be so likely to send these missiles out. Okay, so they said that this is signaling to China that we want to put weapons in space and essentially targeting China and threatening China. So we would like to reinstate our plan. So as we said, we are not leaving until 2025. It is 2021 right now. So this gives China a good amount of time to, and we also said that we're making our intentions known. I'll take it at the end of this contention. We said that we will make our intentions known to China. So China will have the knowledge that we are leaving this treaty. And since it's happening so many years from the time that we tell them to when it actually happens, they're not going to immediately see it as a military threat. They're going to be well aware of it for years, and it's going to be known to them, so when we actually do leave the treaty, they won't be surprised and they won't be threatened. And I'd also like to point out that China and the US have already had conflict for many years now. China is already threatened by the US, so this wouldn't really be any sort of surprise or change to China, since they have been in conflict for years now, and it will not be surprising. If anything, they will be more happy about it because they will have the ability to claim their own property in space and not argue or fight with the US or China or North Korea or other global superpowers over these celestial bodies, as they have been doing in the status quo. So basically they just talked about the impacts of war between the USA and China. As we have talked about, there's no enforcement of the treaty. China and the US have been sending missiles and nuclear weapons to space. They have been fighting over these celestial bodies because no one can have a claim on them. So it is highly more likely that we will see people essentially raising conflicts between the US and China because they aren't communicating, because they're already sending missiles and completely ignoring the treaty in the first place, meaning that we would essentially be doing more harm to stay in the treaty now, in the status quo, than to leave where we have numerous benefits, as we have talked about in our contentions. So moving into our response to their second contention, which is liability in space. Yeah, actually, I'll take the POI now.
Why do official territorial claims so significantly decrease the risk of conflict in space?
So because these large global superpowers would have claim on these territories, and as I've explained before, there wouldn't be basically this lack of communication and lack of authority in space. People would have the ability to claim territories in space and to have an actual reason to go to space, an incentive to go to space. And because China, for example, could be working on one planet and Russia could be working on another, there's large likelihood to assume that they wouldn't want to work on the same planet, since space is such a huge atmosphere and there are lots of places they can work, instead of simply going to the same planet for the exact purpose of increasing tensions with the other country. We know that US and China, or US and Russia, aren't on the greatest terms. So that means that if US goes to one country or one planet, Russia might want to go to the same planet just for the purpose of aggravating the US, because they can. Because there is no enforcement of the treaty that says that they cannot go to the same planet and start mining the same things and taking the same resources. So they might do it for this pure point of angering the US, whereas in our world, we would have enforcement of claim on planets, which means that they'd be less likely to do it strictly for the reason of increasing tensions. Yeah, I'll take it at the end if I have time, because I have 1 minute left in my speech. So now moving on to their responses to our plan. They say how the US is not influential and is decreasing in value, and this is why it's unlikely anyone would pull out. They have no link to this, but also the US is globally influential. We have known that the US is a global superpower for many years now, and of course, since they are on such a high priority with China and Russia, these major countries, we can see that it's actually very feasible that they would follow suit and follow the US in our world. Now moving on to some of their responses to our contentions. So they were saying how developing countries have no reason to explore space and don't need to. This is actually false. Developing countries need it more than ever because they need access to these resources more than larger countries, because they need this development and technology, because they are worse off, because they are underdeveloped and have lower technology than these major countries, and therefore need the resources and the value of going to space more than these larger countries who already have the resources and already have sent humans to space multiple times. But they don't have the ability to right now, as we talked about in the status quo, which is what we were going to be changing. So then they say that China and the USA will claim all the territory. As we talked about, outer space is a massive place, and because the US and China can't claim the same territory, they're going to be claiming specific planets, and there are so many other asteroids, celestial bodies, planets that other countries can claim, because we were talking about the entirety of outer space right now, which, as my partner has claimed, is essentially infinite. So then they respond to our space leaders, as Russia and China, and say, and actually reference Tesla, as we have talked about. Tesla and SpaceX actually had a missile blow up in space right now, and they were not held liable, meaning that that reference does not flow through because the treaty is being largely ignored in the current day. So that does not work. And then they, on our third contention, they didn't really say much, but just to elaborate, this would make space fairly representative for all countries and underdeveloped countries, as we've previously talked about, who don't have the ability or the chance to go to space in the status quo. For all these reasons, I urge strong affirmations of thinking.
All right, so I'm Kai Teigen. I'm the second speaker for the opposition. Give me just a second to set up my timer. All right. So,
I should have offered this to everybody, but does anybody want this to put a laptop on? It might be easier.
sure, that'd be great. Yeah.
Okay. No, just two. Stooping over.
Okay. So I will begin my time now. Okay, so beginning on the top of case. They have only one response to this, right? They respond to our point about how currently states are held liable for damage caused in space by their own non-governmental organizations, right? They say the status quo is not happening. They provide one example of a Tesla satellite exploding. They say there was no fallout for Tesla and so it's not being enforced, right? But the fact of the matter is a Tesla satellite exploding is not causing major environmental damage in space. This is not what this clause was written for, right? This clause was written specifically for resource extraction in space, for the type of mining they're talking about on asteroids, right? For things that actually cause major environmental damage. A small satellite exploding in space is not causing major environmental damage, and they provide you with no statistics or warrants or anything about how it caused major environmental damage, and this is really their only response to this clause, right? They just say, there's this one example where it's not enforced against, therefore this is never going to happen, right? But this is not what the clause was written for. I also want to point out that it have no response to our point about how the treaty specifically prohibits weapons of mass destruction. They say that there are a lot of countries launching missiles into space right now. They say that the US is doing this in addition to China. The US is not doing this in addition to China, right? It is just China. Their efforts are fairly recent to launch this hypersonic missile into space, right? And there would be far more potential for militarization in space without the treaty, right? The treaty is providing some international law saying, no, you should not launch these weapons into space, you should not militarize space, right? And without the treaty, it is far easier for space to become militarized both by militant people in the US, right, like the Pentagon, and by war hawks in China. So moving down the case on contention 1, we talked about how this is going to increase militarism between the US and China, right? So they say that actually the treaty is what's going to increase militarism between the US and China because they'll be fighting over resources on the same asteroids, right? I want to first point out a contradiction in their case because they're saying that once we have territorial claims, because space is so big, different countries can just go to different asteroids, can just go to different planets. There's no reason to have to fight over territory, right? But why can't that happen also with the treaty, right? Why is that specific to territorial claims? If they say space is so big and there are so many asteroids, why would Russia choose right now to risk a conflict with the United States over mining the same asteroid when they could just go to a different asteroid into space that they claim is so big, right? This idea there's going to be massive conflict as a result of this lack of territorial claims doesn't make sense. I'd also like to point out their idea that territorial claims just magically means that there's not going to be any conflict simply isn't true. We see in the status quo on Earth there are a lot of territorial disputes, especially involving China, right? China has territorial disputes all over the South China Sea. That's the reason why there's so much militarization there. Look at Taiwan, right? Taiwan is a territorial dispute. China has territorial disputes with Japan, right? Just because you claim something as your territory doesn't mean someone else isn't going to also try to claim that as their territory, right? And that's how conflict happens. When countries start being able to claim places as their sovereign territory, what that means is they're saying, this is our territory now. If you come onto our territory, you are declaring war. This is an act of aggression against us. And that's how conflicts happen. That's how violence actually breaks out. Our opponents just don't seem to really understand how territorial claims really work. So their next point is that Right, there is no conflict now in space. They cite this like kind of vague idea that right now people are fighting in space over extracting resources. Not at all, right? China has tested this one missile. They're kind of pushing at the bounds of this treaty, right? But because of the treaty, we can actually call them out for this, right? Because of the treaty, we have a sort of moral high ground. We can say, look, China is trying to militarize space, and this is not okay. We should fight against these militarization efforts, right? If we got rid of the treaty, instead of using diplomatic efforts and soft power to try and decrease the militarization of space, we'll leave it to the Pentagon, right? The Pentagon will instead choose to increase the militarization in space on our own side, right? And so there will be more weapons in space overall. Missiles from the US, missiles from China, right? There's going to be more territorial claims, there's going to be more conflict in space. This is in like direct contradiction with their own contention about conflict in space. They say that we are not leaving until 2025, which gives China plenty of time to prepare and not be concerned about this. I would actually turn this point, right? If we're not leaving the treaty until 2025 and we announce it now, who's to say that China won't leave before us, won't leave right now, right? And get a head start on militarizing space, right? Because of the specific text of their plan and their idea, and the idea that once this treaty is dropped, people will be able to militarize space, you can see that China will actually gain a large advantage over the US, which is a bad thing because China is a bad actor. So moving down to our contention about sustainability, this is hardly responded to, right? They kind of tried to respond to it with the Tesla claim, but all of the analysis is dropped, right? All of the analysis about how right now countries are indeed held liable for unsustainable actions taken by their non-governmental organizations dropped, right? That's an incentive for countries to try to regulate to try and regulate their companies, their corporations from taking massive environmental steps in space that could really mess up the environment in space, right? If the treaty is dropped, this will no longer be existent, right? Corporations will not be really regulated in space because there's no incentive to do so. There's no potential penalty for not regulating your corporations. This analysis is dropped, so extend it for the purpose of the round, right? Taking this true. On the government's case, their first contention is about how this is going to increase exploration and innovation. So we refuted most of this contention. They only really responded to a couple of our refutations. Their response to our refutation about developing countries was that developing countries do want to access space because they want these resources from the moon, right? But again, this drops all of the analysis that right now, developing countries are often struggling with basic infrastructure. Water, healthcare, basic necessities, right? If you are a country in, say, an undeveloped place, in your country in South America, who still hasn't figured out, say, corruption or infrastructure to get energy to all of your citizens, why would you be spending a massive amount of your national budget on exploring space for minerals that we don't even know what the purpose of them is, right? This just doesn't make sense. There's no incentive for developing countries to go into space regardless of the treaty, and so all the points they make here are not unique, right? The next point they make is that outer space is massive. China and the US are not going to claim the same territory. Again, I want to point out the contradiction in their case, right? They need to decide on one or the other. Either outer space is massive and there's going to be no conflict at all on either side of the house, right? In which case, their points about how things are going to get militarized is non-unique, right? Or outer space is not massive and there's going to be territorial conflicts, in which case, whether there is territory claimed or things not officially claimed with people trying to mine on the same asteroid, there will be conflict, right? The only unique potential for conflict is on our side of the house, where we say that without the treaty, it's very possible for missile systems to be set up in space that could actually pose a threat to people on Earth, right? That's the only unique militant threat, and it's specifically if you get rid of the treaty because of this WMD clause, right? Their next contention, they talk about how SpaceX and NASA had a satellite blow up, which means that they're not exploring space. We basically presented with all this analysis. They say that we're not exploring space right now. We clearly are. SpaceX and NASA are doing this. Jeff Bezos is trying to explore space, right? And their only response to this is that they had a satellite blow up, which means they must not be trying very hard, right? This just doesn't make sense. All of this analysis about how space isn't being explored is clearly refuted by what you see happening in the status quo. Go check this, right? Have you seen all of a sudden that no one wants to explore space? No, not at all. People still want to explore space. They still want innovation. They still see all of these benefits regardless of territorial claims. And space exploration will continue even with the treaty in place as it has for the past 5 decades. So their last contention is barely warranted. They say this is going to make space more representative. I don't really see how. They also seem to be contradicting themselves here because on their first speech they said that the problem is there are too many people in the space treaty that don't have anything to do with space. In their second speech they're saying that this is going to let those people in. This doesn't really make sense. This is not going to increase access to space for developing countries, right? So what are the unique impacts we see in this case? Number one, if you get rid of the treaty, you're going to cause massive environmental damage in space. You'll make unsustainable NGOs. This goes mostly unrefuted. Extend this and weigh on this for the purpose of the round. Number two, if you get rid of the treaty in space, there will be mass WMD proliferation in space, which poses an extreme threat to the lives and livelihood of everyone here on Earth, right? All the points that they make about potential conflict that could happen in space will still happen under their plan because they provided you with no warranting for why claiming territory actually makes an area peaceful, for why claiming territory means there's no potential for conflict, right? All of the unique advantages and impacts in this case are on our side of the house. Let's see if I have anything else to cover. Yes, I'm out of time. Thank you so much for your time. You do it for that opposition in this case.
Okay, I will be going over 2 voting issues in my rebuttal, and then I will be going into weighing. My first voting issue is about reducing conflict in space. And I think this is a pretty big impact in around. I think it's probably the most important thing. It has the highest amount of impact. We say that when the United States makes this huge declaration, hey, we are leaving a treaty that prevents us from militarizing in space. When we say that to the world, and we make this huge declaration that side government says we're going to make, China's going to be here like, oh no, now's our time to ramp up militarization in space. We're going to pull out before 2025. We're going to increase our militarization in space. And we're not going to listen to the US anymore. Now tensions with the US are higher than ever after this declaration is made. Because that's how China's going to perceive it. That's how the whole world is going to perceive it. They're going to say, oh, the US wants to militarize in space. Okay. And that's how it's going to go. They say that territorial claims are actually the big conflict. That's what we need to prevent. And by people being able to be like, hey, this is mine, this is mine, this is mine, then this will this is what we need to prevent. Okay, so the first thing you need to realize is that this doesn't really happen right now. Is there really huge conflicts between the US and China about who owns an asteroid and who can extract resources from it? No, because nobody's doing this. The second thing is that you can see that there's a contradiction. They say space is so vast, so there's no reason that people should be fighting over resources. You can't conclude that people will be fighting over resources when they themselves say that space is so vast and resources are so expansive that developing countries will have room even if the US buys up all of space. The third thing that you need to take into consideration is that in the status quo, even when China's like, hey, Taiwan's ours, the US is like, no, Taiwan's ours, or Taiwan's independent. Conflict is happening right now. Making claims over territory doesn't actually do anything besides create some false sense of officialness. So the only thing that happens is that militarism in space and just conflict domestically anywhere between the United States and China will ramp up because the United States, by leaving this treaty, is essentially making a declaration, hey, we want to militarize further, we want to fight China further, and this is only going to do damage to the conflicts that are already happening. Okay, second voting issue is about damage caused in space. Right now, we talk a lot about how there's an incentive for people not to damage space because the government has an incentive to keep SpaceX and private companies in check. Without this, we could damage space greatly because there is no incentive, there's no liability for the United States government if SpaceX is, extracting a ton of resources in space. This poses a huge risk. If we create moon erosion, this could be awful for people in the United States, and it could destroy ecosystems in space that we don't really know about yet. This has been pretty much unrefuted. The only thing is this whole satellite thing, but they didn't even say how much damage that did. They just said it blew up. It could have blown up in space and not done anything aside from blow up. Okay, now let's get into some weighing. First, let's talk about probability. There's a very low probability that by making claims over territory, you will see a decrease in conflict because this simply doesn't happen in the status quo. China can say, this is mine, the US can say, this is mine, and they can have a war over it. There have been so many wars over two people claiming the same territory. Right now, people don't even try to claim the same territory, and this is good, and that is why conflict isn't happening right now. But the probability of militarization increasing is very high. This is because it's happening right now every single time the United States does something that seems as though it's going to increase militarization, like give Australia submarines. This is increasing tension. Every time the United States does something that seems as though it could threaten China, it increases tension. And it's happening right now, and this would only further the pattern that we're already seeing. Now let's talk about magnitude. We need to prevent conflict between China and the United States at all costs. And if you think that this plan could somehow increase tensions between China and the US, you should be voting for side opposition, because this has the highest ability to impact people's lives in a negative way. So for all of these reasons, I urge an opposition ballot. Thank you.
Do you guys mind if I pause that?
No.
While you're getting that, I'm going to close the blinds because the backlight is interfering with the video. You can figure it out. Oh, it's over there. Sorry.
Okay. First, I'm just going to be going over the cases and responding to a few of their arguments that they brought up just now, and then I'm going to be going into observations and voting issues. My time starts now. Okay, so let's start on their case. Their first contention is all about how there are growing tensions in space and it's going to increase militarization. They tell you, we give you an example of how a missile, they tell you like, oh, a missile was launched into space. And exactly, that's the point. If somebody launched a missile into space, what does that mean? That means that this treaty has no enforcement whatsoever. My partner brought up that this treaty doesn't actually have any way of enforcing it, because it's just a treaty. That's it. It doesn't have, you know, international body governing like a military force to enforce this treaty. So what does this mean? If this treaty has no enforcement, that means that all of their impacts about how like, oh, people are going to start militarizing space if we remove the treaty, isn't really true, because they can militarize space right now. And they brought up an example of China launching a missile. What does that mean? Countries are militarizing space right now. Okay, so we can see that if countries are militarizing space right now, all of their impacts about how like, oh, if we don't withdraw from the treaty, like everything's going to be so peaceful and nobody's going to hurt the environment, really aren't true, because countries have the ability to basically militarize space in the status quo, and we see them doing it with their own example, right? Also, they talk about how they bring up this example of SpaceX. They say that, oh, if we leave the treaty, SpaceX is going to have infinite control of space, and they're going to be able to do anything. Well, if SpaceX has so much control of space, then shouldn't they be held liable? I would think so, but we give you an example. A SpaceX rocket, or a SpaceX satellite, actually exploded in space a few months ago. And what happened was all of this debris.
Hila, the analysis about the debris, like the only thing that you said before was it exploded. We called you out multiple times for like not explaining like the damage that it did, and this is the first time you're talking about the actual damage that the satellite explosion did. The only thing you said before was that it exploded. You didn't give any of this analysis previously.
Okay, so my partner brought this up in her speech, and then they responded to it, so we weren't able to give any of the reasoning or analysis. We didn't know what their responses were going to be, so now I'm responding to their arguments for the very first time, because I haven't had a chance to respond to their attacks on this argument yet. So it's not a new argument.
Judge's discretion.
Judge's discretion. So should I keep going with that, or should I? Okay. Yeah, so if this SpaceX rocket exploded, all of this debris, a miniature piece of debris can cause insane damage in space because it can move at incredible speeds. So this debris can cause huge environmental damage. Either way, an explosion in space causes damage. We know that. And SpaceX was not held liable. So all of their impacts about how like, oh, we're going to militarize space and space is going to be held liable aren't really true, because if space were being held liable right now, which is what they try to tell you, then wouldn't SpaceX or the United States have been held liable? Well, they weren't, because this treaty has no enforcement. So we see that under their side, all of these arguments about how like it's not like countries are currently held liable, and it's currently and this treaty is currently being, you know, preventing militarization aren't true, because they give you their own examples of SpaceX and militarizing space currently. So we see that they are completely contradicting themselves with their examples. They tell you that countries and SpaceX are militarizing space, so we'll agree with them. So what does that mean in our world? If we leave the treaty, what does that mean? Well, countries are now able to claim territory. They tell you that, oh, claiming territory doesn't matter because space is so big. Well, we agree. Space is big. We brought that up in our own argument. But resources are often concentrated in space. So a single asteroid might have a concentration of one mineral. Most things in space do not have.
Point of order.
Yeah.
The point that space is vast, but minerals and resources are specifically concentrated in only small areas entirely do not run up in either construction.
Okay, so that argument was brought up in your very last speech, so we have had no opportunity to respond to it. So in my last speech, I'm able to respond to arguments that he brought up in his last speech.
Judge's discretion.
Okay. Yeah, continuing my time. So what we see is that these, so claiming territory leads, because countries will want to claim the same territory, and because countries might want to anger other countries, so when countries claim territory, they will not be able, like other countries are going to be less likely to claim that same territory. If you claim territory, like when the United States claimed America, that meant that other countries were not going to come and claim the same thing. And either way, that offers more protection to countries than if it's just a free-for-all. If everybody can come settle the same asteroid or the same star, that means that essentially everybody, it's a free-for-all on that planet and everybody can extract resources. But claiming things essentially gives you the right to it. So while there could potentially be conflicts over claims, there are going to be significantly less conflicts than if it's just a free-for-all and everybody can pile onto the same planet to extract the exact same resources. Now, finally, let's talk about space innovation. So, we tell you a lot about how right now this country is limiting space exploration. Their only responses are that, like, oh, space innovation for poor countries doesn't really matter. However, often these struggling countries are the poorest and they need this the most. There are only 11 countries that have gone to space, and there are 170 or more that haven't yet. So not all of these countries are poor, and a lot of them want to go to space, which will give them more of a chance to compete with these global giants, right? So going to space is actually even more important for a lot of these countries. So in their world, we see that none of their impacts are really unique because countries right now aren't being held liable. So in our world, countries are more able, you're able to claim space, which reduces conflict, and innovation is going to be more prevalent. For all these reasons, I urge a strong affirmation vote. Thank you.